The waiting room smelled like floor wax and old coffee. I'd been sitting there for nearly 40 minutes when the door finally opened, and a young woman in scrubs stepped out, looked at her clipboard, and called a name that wasn't mine. I shifted in the plastic chair and stared at the television mounted in the corner. Some afternoon talk show, couples arguing about something I couldn't follow. I turned away. It was a Tuesday in late October, and I was back in the United States for the first time in 14 months. Not retired yet. Not quite. I still had my rank, still had my orders, still had the 31 years behind me that said I belonged to something larger than myself. But for 3 weeks, I had unexpected leave. My replacement at the logistics command in Stuttgart had arrived ahead of schedule, which meant I had time I hadn't planned for and a wife I hadn't held in over a year. I hadn't told her. I wanted to surprise Margaret. We had been married for 29 years. She was a pediatric cardiologist at Mercy General Hospital in Portland, Oregon. Smart, beautiful, the kind of woman who still made me nervous in a good way when I caught her laughing at something across a crowded room. People used to say we were an unlikely pair, the soldier and the doctor, but we always said we understood each other because we both believed in showing up. She showed up for her patients. I showed up for my country. That was the agreement, unspoken but real, and for most of our marriage I believed we were both honoring it. So I flew into Portland International Airport on a gray Wednesday morning. I was 63 years old and wearing civilian clothes, just khakis and a jacket, because I was scheduled for nothing official until the following week. I carried a single bag. I had a reservation at a hotel nearby just in case the surprise felt like too much and Margaret needed a moment to breathe before I was underfoot in her space again. That was the kind of man I thought I was. Considerate, patient, good at reading situations. I called a car and gave the driver the address of Mercy General. My plan was to walk into her department, find someone who knew her, and ask them to send her out with some excuse. Then I'd be standing there, her husband, home early, holding the coffee she liked from the cart on Fifth Avenue that she'd mentioned in one of her emails 3 months ago. Small things. After a long absence, small things matter the most. The hospital was a large campus, newer buildings connected to older ones by covered walkways. I'd visited twice before during the years Margaret worked there. The cardiology wing was on the 4th floor of the main building. I remembered the layout well enough. At the front desk, a young man asked for my name and who I was visiting. I smiled. I'm here to surprise my wife. She works in pediatric cardiology. Of course. Name? Margaret Calloway. He typed something and glanced up. And you are? Her husband. I paused. James Calloway. The young man looked at his screen for a moment. Then he looked at me with an expression I didn't know how to read. Not suspicious exactly. More like careful. Sir, he said slowly, I'm going to need to check on something. Everything okay? He held up one finger and reached for his phone. He turned slightly away and spoke in a low voice. I couldn't make out the words. I stood there with a coffee cup in each hand, feeling faintly ridiculous. He hung up and looked back at me. His tone was polite but deliberate. I apologize for the confusion. I just need to clarify Dr. Calloway's husband is currently in the building. I stared at him. I'm sorry? Her husband. He checked his screen again. He's listed as an emergency contact and he signed in about 40 minutes ago. He paused. He's upstairs with her now. I set the coffee cups down on the edge of the counter. My husband is already here. The words didn't make sense at first. They arranged themselves in my mind and then immediately fell apart, like a sentence written in a language I half knew. I thought perhaps there had been a database error, some clerical mix-up. Names get confused in large hospitals. It happened all the time. That's not possible, I said. I'm her husband. I just flew in from Germany. The young man looked uncomfortable. I didn't blame him. This was not a situation his training had prepared him for. Sir, I think you may want to speak directly with Dr. Calloway. He reached for his phone again. I put my hand up. Don't call her, I said. Not yet. I picked up both coffees. I walked to a row of chairs near the window and sat down. Outside, the Oregon sky was the color of old pewter. Rain was coming. 31 years in the military teaches you many things, but the most important one is this. Never act on incomplete information. When something doesn't make sense, you don't react. You observe, you gather facts, you make sure you understand the terrain before you move. I sat in that chair for nearly an hour. I thought about every reasonable explanation. A brother I didn't know about, a misunderstanding in the system, a researcher or physician with a similar name. I went through the list carefully, the way I had been trained to process conflicting intelligence reports. You start with the most likely, work toward the least. You don't skip to the dramatic conclusion simply because it frightens you. By the time I walked back to the desk, I had exhausted the reasonable explanations. I booked a room at a hotel 4 blocks from the hospital. I did not call Margaret. I needed facts. The first thing I did in that hotel room was open my laptop and log into our shared email account. Margaret and I had set it up years earlier, a practical arrangement for coordinating bills, insurance, household matters while I was overseas. I hadn't used it in months. She had full access. I had full access. Neither of us had ever abused that trust. I found nothing unusual in the inbox. But in the sent folder, something caught my attention. 3 months earlier, Margaret had replied to a message from our homeowner's insurance company. The message mentioned a policy update and included a secondary policyholder name that wasn't mine. The name was Daniel Reese. I sat very still. Then I searched for that name everywhere I could. In the email archive, in our shared calendar, which I hadn't checked since spring. What I found on the calendar nearly stopped my breathing. Dinners. Weekend trips to the coast. A reservation at a resort in Cannon Beach labeled simply Us. Concert tickets. A birthday dinner at a restaurant in the Pearl District. All of it over the past 18 months. All of it while I was in Stuttgart. I closed the laptop. I was 63 years old. I had served in 2 combat theaters, 3 command positions, and more bureaucratic battles than I could count. I thought I understood betrayal in the abstract, what it looked like, how it worked, how people justified it to themselves. I had counseled younger officers through divorces. I had written letters of character support for good soldiers whose marriages hadn't survived deployment. I had never once imagined writing my own. I didn't sleep that night. I sat beside the window and watched Portland go quiet and then go dark. I kept thinking about the last time Margaret and I had spoken on video call. She had been in her kitchen, the one we picked out together when we renovated 6 years ago. She'd been wearing a sweater I bought her in Munich. She'd asked me what the weather was like in Stuttgart and laughed when I said gray. Was he in that house while we were talking? I forced myself to stop. The next morning I called my oldest friend, Frank Dempsey. We'd served together for 12 years before he took an early retirement and moved to Bend. Frank answered before the second ring. James, you're back early. I am. Something in my voice must have told him everything, because he didn't ask any more questions for a long time. He just waited. I told him what I knew. The front desk. The name in the calendar. The calendar entries. All of it. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You haven't confronted her. No. Good. I need more information. Yes, you do. He paused. You need to know who this person is. I already have a name. Then start there. Daniel Reese was 47 years old. He was a commercial real estate developer based in Portland. He had no military background, no medical background, no obvious connection to Mercy General that I could find through public records. He had a LinkedIn profile with a professional photograph, dark hair, well-dressed, the kind of man who looked comfortable in a room full of money. What bothered me most wasn't finding him. It was what I found next. I have a nephew, my sister's son Kevin, who works in financial services in Seattle. He was always the practical one in the family, the one who read fine print. I called him and explained what I needed without explaining why. He knew not to press. 2 days later, Kevin called me back. Uncle James, he said carefully, are you and Margaret still joint account holders on your savings and investment accounts? Yes, we've always been. A pause. When's the last time you checked the investment account balance? I hadn't checked it in nearly 8 months. I trusted Margaret to handle our finances while I was deployed. We had always done it that way. Why? I asked. Because there have been significant withdrawals over the past 14 months. I'm looking at figures in the range of... Kevin stopped. I think you need to sit down for this. I was already sitting down. But I understood what he meant. The number he gave me was not a small number. I hung up the phone and stared at the wall of my hotel room for a long time. This was no longer simply a matter of an affair. Whatever Margaret and Daniel Reese had built together, it had moved into territory I recognized from a different kind of work. Deliberate, structured, timed to happen while I was far away and occupied. The money, the calendar, the name listed on our insurance policy. Someone had decided my absence was a window. I called an attorney the following morning. His name was Thomas Wakefield, a man I had met years earlier through the JAG officer community. He practiced family and civil law in Portland and had a reputation for being thorough and unhurried, both qualities I needed. Thomas listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said two things. First, don't move any money and don't say anything to Margaret yet. Second, come to my office this afternoon. I sat across from him at a desk covered in yellow legal pads, and he asked me to walk through everything again from the beginning, this time more slowly. He took notes. He asked questions about the investment accounts, the property, any business interests Margaret and I shared, any loans in both names. When we finished, he leaned back and looked at me. James, the financial piece concerns me more than the personal piece. I know. Removing funds from joint accounts without your knowledge and consent, particularly in the amounts you're describing, is not just a marital issue. He tapped his pen against the pad. Depending on how it was done and where the money went, it may be considerably more than that. How long to find out? I've worked with a forensic accountant before. Good man. Former IRS. If we can get him started this week, probably 10 days to 2 weeks for a preliminary picture. Do it. Thomas nodded. And James, are you prepared for what we might find? I thought about that. Not just about Margaret. About the 30 years I had given to something I believed in. About every missed birthday and every holiday dinner that I had swallowed the guilt of because I believed the sacrifice was meaningful. About a woman I had trusted, with everything I couldn't carry with me across the ocean. Yes, I said. I've been preparing my whole life for hard information. The forensic accountant's name was Philip Carr. He was 68 years old, semi-retired, and wore the kind of reading glasses that make a man look like he's permanently solving a puzzle. When we first met, he shook my hand and said, "Colonel, I want you to know, I've done this kind of work for a long time. I don't do it fast, but I do it right." He didn't disappoint. What Philip uncovered over the next 12 days was methodical and, in its own way, almost impressive in how carefully it had been constructed. The withdrawals from the investment account had been spread across 14 months, and various amounts never large enough in any single transaction to trigger automatic alerts. Always moved to intermediate accounts before landing somewhere else. Some of the receiving accounts had connections to a property holding company registered in Nevada. That company had Daniel Reese listed as a registered agent. Philip set his glasses down on the table and looked at me. "Colonel, this wasn't spontaneous. The structuring alone, the way the transfers were timed and sized, suggests deliberate planning." I looked at the documents in front of me. "How long do you think this was planned?" Philip was quiet for a moment. "Based on when the Nevada company was registered?" He checked his notes. "Approximately 2 years ago." 2 years. 2 years before I returned. 2 years before anyone would have known when I might come home. Thomas Wakefield reviewed Philip's preliminary findings on a Friday afternoon. He set the pages down carefully. "We have enough," he said. "More than enough." "For what?" "To ensure you're protected." "In every sense." He looked at me. "The question now is how you want to proceed." I had been thinking about that since the moment I walked out of Mercy General with 2 cups of coffee I never gave to anyone. I had thought about it quietly, without anger, the way I thought about operational planning. What is the objective? What outcome serves the mission? What is the right way to do this? I was not interested in revenge. I want to be clear about that, because I've told this story a few times now and people always assume the goal was destruction. It wasn't. I didn't want to humiliate Margaret. I didn't want to end her career or ruin Daniel Reese out of spite. I wanted the truth acknowledged. I wanted what was taken from me, not just the money, back. And I wanted to stop living inside a lie. There is a difference between justice and revenge. Revenge is about making someone feel what you felt. Justice is about restoring what is right. I chose justice. the opportunity arrived the following week. Every year, in early November, Mercy General Hospital held its annual Founders Gala, a fundraising dinner attended by the hospital board, major donors, senior physicians, and community leaders. It was the most important public event of the hospital's social calendar. Margaret had attended it every year for the past 11 years. That year, for the first time, she had listed a guest. The guest's name was Daniel Reese. Thomas Wakefield reviewed the guest list through a contact on the hospital foundation board. He confirmed both names. Margaret and Daniel were seated at a table with 3 board members and 2 major institutional donors. The irony was not lost on me. She had chosen the most public possible setting. So had I. I arrived at the Benson Hotel in downtown Portland on a Saturday evening at 7:45. I wore my dress uniform not to make a statement, but because I had attended military formal events for 30 years and it was simply how I dressed for occasions that mattered. The ribbons on my chest represented a career, a life, a set of choices I had made, every single one of them with full awareness of the cost. Thomas Wakefield was already inside. Philip Carr had prepared copies of the relevant documentation. 3 board members had been contacted privately in advance and agreed to step outside the main room to receive information before the evening concluded. They deserved to know. Not everything was a personal matter between a husband and a wife. I walked through the entrance of the ballroom. The room was full, 300 people at round tables beneath chandeliers. The noise of a successful evening, glasses, laughter, the soft hum of a string quartet. I stood at the entrance for a moment and looked across the room until I found her. Margaret was at the far end of the room, seated, laughing at something the man beside her had said. She looked exactly as she always did at events like this, elegant, composed, completely at ease. She hadn't changed. That was the strangest part. I kept expecting the person I had built in my mind over the past 2 weeks, the one who had been quietly dismantling our life, to look different from the woman I had loved for 30 years. She didn't. She looked exactly the same. The man beside her was Daniel Reese. I recognized him from his photograph. I moved through the room. People noticed the uniform. A few turned. Some looked curious. I had learned long ago that military dress creates a kind of visual weight in a civilian space. I walked past tables, past waiters carrying dessert trays, toward the far side of the room. Margaret saw me when I was about 15 feet away. I watched the moment her mind processed what her eyes were showing her. The recognition, the color leaving her face, the hand she put on the table as if she needed something solid. Daniel Reese noticed her reaction and turned to follow her gaze. His expression shifted from pleasant to guarded in the space of a second. I stopped at the table. For a moment, none of us spoke. Margaret said my name, very quietly. The way you say something when you're not sure if you're actually seeing it. James. Hello, Margaret. The people at the table were watching now. One of the board members had already pushed his chair back slightly, the instinct of someone who understands when a situation is about to change. Daniel Reese looked at me. He was composed. I'll give him that. I think, I said to the table, keeping my voice calm, that I should introduce myself properly, since I understand there may be some confusion about who I am. I looked at each person in turn. I'm James Calloway, Margaret's husband. We've been married for 29 years. The table went very quiet. One of the donors looked at Margaret, then at Daniel Reese, then back at me. Margaret was very still. Daniel Reese said nothing. I turned to the board member closest to me, a man named Gerald Whitmore, whom I had been briefed on, and knew to be a principled man with a long tenure on the hospital's governance committee. Mr. Whitmore, I said, I wonder if you and a couple of your colleagues might step outside with me for a few minutes. There's some information I believe the board should be aware of. Gerald Whitmore looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly. The nod of a man who has been in enough rooms to know when something serious is being asked of him. Of course, he said. I looked at Margaret one final time. I didn't say anything else. I had nothing left to perform for the room. The people who needed to be informed were about to be informed. The evidence was already in Thomas Wakefield's briefcase by the door. I turned and walked out of the ballroom. Thomas met us in a private room just off the main corridor, a small conference space the hotel had made available. Gerald Whitmore came with two other board members, both of whom had been quietly alerted in advance. Thomas laid out the documents with the efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work for decades. The financial records, the account transfers. The Nevada Holding Company. Philip Carr's preliminary analysis. He did not editorialize. He did not make accusations beyond what the documents themselves demonstrated. He simply presented the information and allowed the board members to draw their own conclusions. They had questions. Thomas answered them carefully. By the time the conversation ended, one board member had already placed a call to the hospital's general counsel. Another had asked for copies of everything to be sent to a specific address by morning. The evening had shifted entirely. I walked back through the hotel lobby and stepped outside into the October air. The rain had arrived by then, that steady northwest rain that doesn't apologize for itself. I stood under the awning and listened to it. I wasn't feeling what people expect you to feel at a moment like that. Not triumph, not relief. Mostly I felt tired. The deep tiredness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally set it down in the right place. The investigation that followed was thorough. The hospital board engaged an outside firm to review the financial connection between Margaret and Daniel Reese and any implications for the institution. The findings, when they were complete, resulted in Margaret taking a leave of absence from her position pending the outcome of further proceedings. Daniel Reese's legal exposure in connection with the investment account transfers became a matter for attorneys who specialized in things well beyond divorce proceedings. I did not attend those hearings. I did not need to. Thomas Wakefield managed the dissolution of our financial arrangements with the precision and patience I had asked of him at the beginning. The process took several months. Property, retirement accounts, investments, everything that two people accumulate over 30 years of a life built together. It was slow, complicated work. On the difficult days, I reminded myself that I had survived things that required considerably more of me than paperwork. I moved into a rented house on the east side of Portland while the legal proceedings unfolded. Nothing fancy. A small yard, a kitchen with good light in the morning, a neighborhood where people walked dogs and waved to each other without expectation. Frank Dempsey drove up from Bend twice that winter just to sit with me. We watched football. We grilled steaks. We didn't talk about Margaret most of the time, and when we did, we were brief about it. Frank had the good sense of a man who knew that some things don't benefit from being talked to death. My nephew Kevin called every Sunday. He had a gift for finding ordinary things to say, which is rarer than people realize. I retired from the Army officially the following February. The ceremony was held at Fort Lewis, a clear and cold morning, the mountains visible in the distance. 31 years. I thought about the boy I had been when I first raised my right hand, 22 years old, barely finished with college, not at all sure of what he was signing up for. I had not been afraid. That surprised me about myself. Even then, I had not been afraid of what came next. Standing at Fort Lewis on my last official day of service, I wasn't afraid either, which surprised me again. After the ceremony, one of the younger officers came up to me, a captain, maybe 30 years old, sharp eyes, the look of someone who was asking real questions rather than performing deference. "Sir," he said, "what do you wish someone had told you at the beginning?" I thought about it. "Don't confuse endurance with love," I said. "They can look the same for a long time, but they're not the same." He nodded. I hoped he understood. I wasn't sure I had, not fully, until recently. 6 months after the legal proceedings concluded, I received a letter from Margaret, not an email. A letter, 3 pages, handwritten, which surprised me. Margaret had always typed everything. She said the handwriting was intentional. She wanted it to be harder to send. I don't want to share everything that was in it because some things belong only to the people they were written for. But I'll say this. She didn't ask me to forgive her. She wasn't writing to be absolved. She was writing because she needed me to know that what we had built together was real, even if what she had done to it was also real. Those two things can be true at once. It took me a while to accept that. I sat with the letter for several days before I replied. When I did, I kept it short. I told her I didn't hold contempt for her. I told her I was not going to spend whatever years I had left carrying anger like a second deployment. I told her I hoped she found her way to something honest. I meant all of it. People ask whether I forgave her. I always say yes, eventually, and they always seem to expect the story behind that to be more dramatic than it is. The truth is, I forgave her because anger is exhausting and I have been tired enough. Not because she deserved it. Forgiveness is not a reward. It's a decision you make for yourself, not for the person who hurt you. That distinction matters. I am 64 years old now. I live in a house I chose for myself, which is a thing I had never done before. I spend mornings with coffee and the newspaper, which is a routine I am not sorry to have acquired. I volunteer twice a week with a veteran support program in the Portland area, mostly younger men and women transitioning out of service, trying to figure out who they are when the uniform comes off. I understand that disorientation better than I expected to. Last month, one of the younger veterans in the program, a Marine, early 30s, just back from his second deployment, asked me how you rebuild after something tears the foundation out from under you. I thought about it. The same way you do anything in the field? I said. You assess the terrain as it actually is, not as you wished it was, not as it used to be, as it is, and then you take the next step available to you. He thought about that. That's it? That's it. He looked like he wasn't sure whether to be relieved or disappointed. I remember feeling both at once. The simplest answers are always the hardest to trust. What I know now, and what I couldn't have known 30 years ago, is that a life belongs to the person living it, not to the institution you serve, not to the person you marry, not to the version of yourself you were when you made your earliest promises. You can honor all of those things without surrendering ownership of the one life you actually have. I surrendered mine for too long. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it the way you talk about a lesson that costs something real, with respect for the price and gratitude that the learning happened at all, even late. It's a Tuesday morning as I'm telling you this. The light through the kitchen window is the particular shade of gold that only comes in late November in the Pacific Northwest, when the sun is low and the air has that clean edge to it. I'm on my second cup of coffee. The yard needs raking. I'm in no hurry. Some mornings, that simple fact that I am in no hurry feels like the most remarkable thing in the world. If you have spent years believing that sacrifice and love are the same thing, I want you to hear this. They are not. Sacrifice is something you give. Love is something that is given back. When only one of you is giving, that's not a partnership. That's a deployment with no end date. Know the difference. Demand the difference. You've earned it. We all have. Thank you for listening. If this story brought back something you're carrying, I hope you find a way to set it down. And if you've ever had to rebuild from nothing and found your footing anyway, you already know everything I just said is true. Take care of yourself. We'll talk again soon. Sacrifice without reciprocity is not devotion, it's disappearance. James gave 31 years, believing that showing up for his country meant his marriage was safe at home. It wasn't. But here's what nobody can take from him. The moment he chose dignity over bitterness, he reclaimed himself. Forgiveness didn't excuse what happened. It freed him. And some mornings, a quiet cup of coffee in a house you chose for yourself is worth more than anything you lost. A small note to our listeners. This story was created and imagined by AI, crafted to entertain you and carry a little something true about life home with you.